Hi there, I'm Kat Rosenfield.
And I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and we are Feminine Chaos. Moderately chaotic this week. So what we're going to start with is a topic that Kat and I both have some firsthand knowledge of from life, being specifically the topic of white women.
Which we
will discuss this, which we are, although my capacity as a white Jewish woman to fully experience white womanhood, we will discuss and pick apart at Talmudic length. No. So basically what's happened, so this is a topic that I've found fascinating, not just from the sort of like narcissistic navel gaze type angle, but just sort of for a while, it seems like there's this strange discourse in progressive social media, articles, and so forth about white ladies, white women, white feminism, and so forth, where it's kind of either white women are sort of the epitome of privilege and discussed as kind of not just similarly potentially problematic to white men, but more so. And then this is what's been happening, or what was happening until very recently in terms of MeToo and specifically Kavanaugh and all of this, is then there's this other narrative where women of any background, including women whose only, sort of recognized on the left disadvantage as being a woman, are sort of discussed as the ultimate victims, no matter what, and that would be these articles and tweets and so forth that were coming out the last few weeks about sort of like how to be a woman is to be afraid to go out past 7 p.m., to be a woman is to be afraid to take the bus at night, and all these different things, right? So there are these two kind of extreme ways of looking at things, where my feeling is, and I even tweeted this, it was basically there's truth to both. There's truth to the fact that not every woman is experiencing womanhood the same way, but also there is sexism, and it does impact even otherwise privileged women. So basically there are these kind of two discourses floating around, right? But then what had happened was it seemed like for a while, especially the beginning of the whole Kavanaugh story, that the one where all women are inherently the ultimate victims had won. And that just seemed to be the moment we were in. And anybody who would challenge that would seem very out of place. But then there was this article by Jessa Crispin in the Baffler. Don't want to confuse it with the Rumpus, which we're going to talk about also later. I keep confusing these two publications, but this article an essay by Jessa Crispin in the Baffler, that's really a review of a couple new books about women and anger, including one by Rebecca Traister, who writes for New York Magazine and is a pretty well-known journalist, but basically saying that that her readers and others of another similar book would never, this is a quote from Crispin's article, would never guess that a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And so there was a sort of, so first we'll talk about the good points that Crispin made, and then maybe the less good. Do you want to?
Sure. I mean, Crispin's review was, it was ultimately, I think, made hard to take seriously in its entirety because it was so wrapped up and enshrouded in this kind of petty, like almost hipster sentiment of, well, I was angry before it was cool.
Yes.
Where have you been?
Yes. I was angry where it was, so we can start with the negative too. Yes, it's I was angry before all of you, and also the sort of how annoying these women trying to sell their book. And it's like, she too has a book out. I'm sure she would like people to buy it as well. That seems like just let's take as a given that everybody with a book wants people to buy it, men and women, and those of other genders.
Yeah.
But yes, but what was the strength? What did she say that was perhaps worthwhile?
Okay. So I was going to go there. I was going to say, despite this inherent weakness in her argument, what I think she does hit on that's actually salient and makes a good point is that Traister doesn't really fully sell the argument that progressive political anger from women is like a uniquely transformative force. It's not that she doesn't pay lip service to the fact that 53% of white women voted for Trump, because she does. I was reading an excerpt of the book this morning because the whole thing is just was too much to get through before we chatted. But she does mention it, but it's interesting that she does it in this very dismissive context. It's like, okay, well, yes, women historically have been angry for other reasons, but they're the bad guys. They're just foot soldiers for the patriarchy. So we're not really going to talk about them. And she just kind of breezes past it. And I think, so from that perspective, she does fail to sell the idea that progressive women's anger is different substantively from either conservative women's or from men's, for that matter. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, the more that I have been reading this and also reading both the criticism and the praise for it, it strikes me that this book isn't really aimed at necessarily making that argument or distilling it. It's more it's almost like a political fairy tale, that's designed to kind of tell young progressive women a story about how romantic and how heroic their anger is in this moment when a lot of them are angry, with the goal of sort of persuading them to remain politically engaged. It's more like a rallying cry than anything else.
I think that's interesting. I think it fits in also, and I guess it seems sort of inevitable that it would have had this book and just sort of this moment of, and it's not just these new books, it's also the sort of celebration of women's anger, with the implication being women on the left or liberal women, certainly anti-Trump women would be the implication. It seems to kind of set itself up for this criticism of where were you before? Mm-hmm. And I think that can be, it's a very viscerally understandable reaction for people who've been politically engaged for a long time, or who, whether or not, so I think this gets to a whole different question of, is it a sign of privilege if you are only now noticing that things are bad? I'm going to say it can be, and it also cannot be. It depends. Some people are incredibly stressed out with their genuinely difficult lives and are not politically engaged for that reason. So there's no sort of hard and fast reason why somebody would only be getting to politics now. But I feel like these books are kind of, and this moment is kind of about, maybe, perhaps, I have not read either of these books, I should say. I've read a lot by Rebecca Traister, though, otherwise. But basically, maybe there is a case for saying, so you're only caring now, that's fine, good that you care. But it does set it up. I feel like these types of arguments do set it up for people to be kind of wondering, well, where were you before? What about, that type of dynamic, especially with Taylor Swift.
Oh, gosh. Right?
Who has recently become outspoken Democrat. It doesn't seem like she's joining any sort of revolution, but she's come out as a Democrat, basically.
She encouraged people to go and vote in the midterm elections and to register to vote, which apparently had a huge impact. I guess, an enormous number. Right.
Well, wasn't it confusing whether it was that it was her or just that it was the deadline?
No, it's hard to know.
Right. I mean, there's been a lot of takes like, well, where was Taylor Swift before? And it's like, I don't know, being like a teeny bop mega star. I don't know. I'm not sure she's exactly.
In her mid-20s.
Yeah, she's not particularly old.
Right. And I mean, the thing is, I feel like the reaction to her, it's, I don't know. I'm sorry, I've got a real cat situation going on here. I feel like the reaction to her finally saying something explicitly political really brought home why she might not have wanted to do that prior. I mean, it's really sort of like damned if she does, damned if she doesn't, because when she was being silent, maybe because out of a desire to either be more educated or be more considered before she spoke out, she was being constantly accused of like supporting Nazism, or fascism, tacitly or however else, because some of her fans are white supremacists. It was, I don't know, it's a rough thing, I think, to basically, to be a 25-year-old woman and to be asked to kind of come out as like a representative of your entire demographic.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with Taylor Swift also, maybe it was a completely cynical, calculated, she wants to sell to as many people as possible move, in which case, I mean, it's, okay. Like, I guess the question is, can somebody just, well, I guess there's a couple questions. Can somebody just want to be a performer / business person and do that and not be politically engaged? And also, is the political engagement and expectation particularly placed on women? And if there were a sort of male Taylor Swift, would there be the same interest in what his politics were?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, are people like super engaged in the question of whether Justin Bieber supports the right political parties? I mean, does he even exist?
I don't think so. I don't. I mean, he's probably, I'm in Canada. I'm looking right now. I think he's probably in LA.
Looking out the window, is he out there?
My goodness, not out here. Yeah, I think that, it's the whole Taylor Swift thing is its own minefield. But then I guess, so what happened though with this Kavanaugh story, I'm going to try to move us along in the narrative, is that then it all changed when Kavanaugh, as we all know, was confirmed. I mean, that's happened. He's now done. That whole thing is done.
He's there. He's hearing cases.
There. He's on the Supreme Court. And I guess a lot sort of coalesced around Senator Susan Collins, not after all opposing him, not after all opposing his confirmation. And then there were all these takes, like by takes, I mean op-eds, tweets, the whole thing, about how white women choose patriarchy over sisterhood and all of this. Most notably one in the New York Times, by Alexis Grinnell, called, and I just have to read the whole headline and subhead because they're kind of amazing, but there's also amazing stuff in the article itself. It's, "White women, come get your people," is the headline, and then with the subhead, "They will defend their privilege to the death," which is strongly phrased.
Yep.
And just a couple quotes from this. The first, the same 53%, so this is the famous percent of white women voters, I believe, who chose Trump in the election. The same 53% who put their racial privilege ahead of their second-class gender status in 2016 by voting to uphold a system that values only their whiteness, just as they have for decades. It's how she describes these white women. And also, "White women benefit from patriarchy" is another quote. Okay, so yes, Blogging Heads listeners, I'm quoting somebody. They're not my views. Okay. I'm quoting Alexis Grinnell's op-ed. She says, she writes, "White women benefit from patriarchy by trading on their whiteness to monopolize resources for mutual gain." So then this op-ed was kind of part of this general shift, I think, kind of on the left, and a pretty sudden one, back to this notion of white women as problematic figures and so forth. So then that became the take, was kind of, rather than thinking, look at here's Christine Blasey Ford, white privileged but the ultimate victim, but then it's like, but wait a second, no, what if it's actually that white women are villains? And it seems like this conversation never seems to allow for any kind of middle ground or nuance or ambiguity or something.
I mean, not only that, but the thing that struck me a lot about the New York Times op-ed, but also about this conversation in general, is that there's never any consideration that the women who aren't politically engaged on the progressive side, who are voting the way that we prefer they not, might have come to that decision in good faith, or at least as part of a considered thought process, that they are in fact choosing their votes and choosing their choices for reasons other than, the influence of the patriarchy. And it's so, I don't know, it sort of denies the agency of these, conservative women who, we may not like the choices that they're making or the way they're voting, can think they're wrong. But the fact that it always goes this step further to be like, if they weren't so brainwashed by their husbands or, by white cis heteropatriarchy or what have you, that they would clearly be voting the other way. And the assumption in that op-ed was that that women were aligning themselves in this kind of conscious way with whiteness over femininity, when I think, most of the women who are voting this way just really don't see the world that way.
Or they, maybe they are prioritizing their whiteness in one way or another, but are they doing so because their husbands made them, or because they are, like their husbands, human beings who happen to be white and are making what I would consider to be not the right political decisions because they want to, not because somebody forced them to. And I feel like there's this kind of weird patronizing angle that this gets to take, where it's like, where there is still this, and I think it comes from this need to reconcile women as victims and women as oppressors, and to somehow have like a quick way of conveying that it's both. And that's really the only way to do it, is to say these are these terrible women who also kind of have no control over their terribleness because the men in their lives have locked them in a room and forced them to vote for whoever, which is terrible if that is happening, but I doubt that's happening on a regular basis.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I certainly know a handful of women, not that I am, connected enough with them to argue that they should vote differently, particularly. But I know women who either have voted Republican or who supported Trump. Most of them, held their noses and did it. But it was never, to hear them discuss it, it was not this conscious decision to like, okay, I'm going to vote my white interests over my female interests. And it kind of goes to the way that Trump voters are often talked about, where there's this sort of assumption of bad faith. It's like, no, you were really voting for racism. You were really voting for xenophobia. When the voters themselves are saying things like, we were concerned about the economy or what have you. There's just this kind of bad faith second guessing going on at all times.
I might have to disagree a bit. So I don't think it's that Trump voters were voting for racism. I do think that they were able to overlook certain things that were already apparent even during the campaign in terms of racism. I think that's different from saying that that was the motivating factor. But I think it obviously couldn't have been a deal breaker, the birtherism and the wall.
Well, no. I mean, but I'm not talking about, things that you've said so much as things that, seem to be more sort of part of the common discourse. It's the assumption that, you don't really believe what you say you believe.
Yes, that is a tricky one. So there is an article in Tablet that was sort of pushing back against this white women discourse by Bridget, and I'm not going to know how to pronounce this.
Oh, Fedesi, I think.
Fedesi. Okay. Thank you. So it had this, it's about white feminism. But anyway, it had this one line that I thought, so it's an article that I can't say I like nodded along the whole way through, but there was one line that I thought was really, really well put. And then there's just a sort of general topic that it brought up that I think is worth mentioning. But the line that I really liked was this, and I'm quoting: "Modern feminism demands I live in a constant state of feeling like a victim. But if I'm white, I need to simultaneously accept that I'm never going to be victim enough. And in fact, I'm actually an oppressor. It's mind bending and bananas, and I won't do it." And I think what that gets at, well, is this sort of that it's either or, that there can't be this notion like that. And I mean, this is something that I've written about a bunch, including the book that I too would like to sell, like all of these horrible feminist women. I too am one of these feminist women who wants to sell a book. But basically that this sort of privilege framework doesn't really allow for this ambiguity. So that I thought was super interesting. But then what she also talks about in this article is this sort of Jewish angle to this, which is something that I've also thought about a lot and written about like before the election, and seems to just get more so. So a lot of the women who both are calling out sort of lets us white feminists fix things, but also a lot of the women who are called out as problematic white ladies are Jewish. It's just true. Like there's, there's been Sheryl Sandberg, Lena Dunham. I could keep going. I'm not going to do like listing Jews o'clock, even though it is going to be on YouTube.
That always ends well.
That's definitely always a good way to go. So I've had a couple reactions to this recently and just over the years. One is that I feel like unclear what either my responsibility or my power is as a white Jewish woman, that as a capitalized, of course, identity and all of this. Like on the one hand, I mean, demographically, yes, 53% of white women went for Trump. I don't think it's actually quite known what percent of white Jewish women did, but given how many Jews did, it's not going to be anything close to 53%. It's going to be very low. Mm-hmm. So there's that, but there's also the question more practically of what I, a New York Jew who lives in Canada, but that's neither here nor there in a sense, because I was actually living back in New York at the time of the election. What influence do I really have over the white women? And I feel like it's pretty low. I also think I'm white. I think I, go around in public spaces reaping the benefits of whiteness. But I don't think I have culturally any particular sway over the white women. And I feel like this notion that I can come and get the white women, I mean, I don't know that anyone can, but I certainly don't think that I can. So that's part of it, how I react to it personally. But then there's this whole question of white women as this group of people who have no experience of sort of the new racism, the new Trump era bigotry. And as a Jewish woman who is on Twitter and has met the Twitter Nazis there, that's not really the case. Like, I can't claim that I have no experience of this. So, I guess I feel a little bit unsure. Like, on the one hand, I guess this makes me, I'm not sure where I'm situated with respect to this question, I guess, with all the white lady stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about this, but Twitter, is a fascinating place for anybody who is white and also Jewish or reads as Jewish, which I do because of my surname. And
that's enough for Twitter.
Yeah, I was going to say, for the people who are fixated on that aspect of things, who all seem to congregate on Twitter, you can have, and at the same time, some woke person calling you a white supremacist, and then an actual white supremacist telling you that they'd like to make your whole family into soap. So it's it's an interesting thing. There's this sort of like homeless aspect to it.
It's this impossibility of kind of. Well, I mean, I know I should have a new thesis or something at this point, but I still think it's this problem with this privilege framework not allowing for any sort of ambiguous situation. So on the one hand, there's the concept of intersectionality, which in some applications can add to nuance, but then there's this kind of more popular sort of privilege framework way of looking at things where it has to do just with being concise, with the length of tweets, with the need for like op-eds to have an argument, and a quick one. There's always got to be a victim and an oppressor in everything, and there can never be this kind of people in ambiguous spots.
Right. It does flatten things. But I think that the sort of victim framework that you were talking about, that, a lot of women are kind of fleeing into that as a direct response to being told that they're responsible for the oppressive acts of white women everywhere and all white women throughout history. That there's this, it's like a defense mechanism where you're being told, like, come collect your people, people with whom you maybe don't have anything actually in common except for a complexion. And there's this natural response to be like, no, I'm as helpless as you. Look how helpless I am. Very oppressed, very victimized. I'm completely powerless. How can I do anything? I can't even ride a bus after 7 p.m. I'm going to write a song about it.
Oh, please.
I'm not going to sing it, but God, it's such an earworm.
I have not listened to it because I thought it sounded... Okay, go ahead. Explain about the song.
Oh, well, so, I mean, I feel like, is there anybody, except for you, maybe, who has not heard this song? And it was a direct response to the conversation taking place surrounding the Kavanaugh hearings about how men are afraid at this point of being accused of, or falsely accused, either. This is always hard to talk about this. They believe that they may be falsely accused of sexual assault.
The scary time for men thing.
Right. So it was a scary time for guys. And, within minutes, it seemed like a very young looking, cute girl with an undercut and platinum blonde hair appeared on Twitter singing a real earworm of a kind of a folk song about how guys shouldn't be scared because women are in fear all of the time, to the point where they not only can't go places where they may be attacked by men, but can't even go places where a man is present. Like the mere possibility of being in a space where also a man might be is too much of a threat.
Mm-hmm. And the notable line, well, there were, I guess, a bunch. Wasn't it something to do with that women can't take the bus after 7 o'clock at night?
Oh yeah, it was
as a woman who takes the bus after 7 o'clock at night. Well, it's just what's so strange about this narrative is I thought that there had been this kind of shift in feminism towards better understanding that the real threat is coming from home. It's coming from inside the house, from male partners, ex-partners, and all of this. And that the notion of the predator jumping out from the bushes is not impossible, but not certainly in most locales that have the target audience for this sort of thing, not really the issue. So that I can't quite figure out.
Well, I guess that, that narrative didn't play as well. You can't write a song about it.
No. I guess to sort of try to wrap up, I guess, the white ladies topic, since there's goodness knows a ton on it. A couple things that I found strange. There's one that's sort of this rhetorical ambiguity between white feminism and white women, where I've seen over the years this kind of blurriness where certainly to do with this 53% that voted for Trump, it's like as if that's the white feminists voted for Trump, when it's
which of course it's not.
White women, yes. White feminists, well, only in some very, very roundabout way where you consider that Ivanka Trump once said she's a feminist and so is her father. Well, I guess that's white feminism. I mean, I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
And then there's also this ambiguity of sort of who is calling out the white ladies. And I think this is a case, I don't think all cases require this, but where the identity of the person doing the call out, both demographic identity and just sort of political identity, is actually pretty crucial. So I think when this call out, like about either white ladies or white feminism, comes from women of color and specifically from feminists of color, it's an internal critique, and very often a very legitimate one, about inclusivity and not just presenting this monolithic notion of a sort of female experience as being white, upper class, or something of that nature. I think when it comes from white men, it can more often maybe be a sort of an excuse to be sexist, but with a progressive cover, sort of where it seems like you're being progressive, but you're actually just saying, aren't women disgusting with their pumpkin spice lattes and whatever, and you know, the yoga pants that cost more than whatever these men think yoga pants should cost.
They're experts on that.
And then there's this sort of, then there's the whole question of sort of white women's place in historical and current racism in the US, which is very tricky because it involves both specifically white women being racist, as well as white women being kind of invoked as the inspiration for racist acts by white men, specifically the really long and really awful history of false accusations against Black men and boys.
Right. It's not as though this idea of white victimhood or white women's victimhood has always been a neutral thing or never used for harm.
Hardly. And this continues to be the case in terms of, as Emily Yaffe, am I right?
I think so.
Okay. Has written about in terms of Title IX cases. And there's just an article in Reason also about an incident apparently in Brooklyn where a white woman, so it's all of these sort of white woman calls the cops type incidents, but especially when they relate to anything sexual, where a white woman falsely accused a young, like really young, a child of
like a 9-year-old.
Of grabbing her butt when there's actually like video evidence that this did not happen. So it's tricky, right? There is the answer, I don't think, should be that, at least where I land on this, is not, you know, white women are, as women, pure victims all the time and can never do anything wrong. But I also think a woman can have every other thing going for her, but still face oppression as a woman in certain contexts.
Yeah. I mean, to me, this whole thing just kind of, you know, illuminates to me that, you know, using this identity-based framework and using kind of like the progressive stack, where it's like, well, you know, who has historically suffered more, who's currently more oppressed, who has been doing the oppressing, you know, can be useful, but also has its limits, especially once you start talking about stuff like this, that, you know, it can flatten the conversation in a way that makes it circular and not particularly useful.
Yeah. I mean, I think it has a way of kind of it makes it harder to make sense of individual cases, right? Because on an individual level, a particular white woman may have it easier than a particular man, including perhaps a particular white man, depends on the circumstances. Also, on an individual level, somebody could be wronged, assaulted, any type of wrong could have happened, where the person who did the bad thing is lower on the privilege hierarchy. Does that mean better to just ignore it? This is actually kind of maybe the segue we need for our next topic of the falsely accused, or not necessarily falsely accused, men of MeToo.
Right. Oh, specifically the ones on the
Yes.
the shitty media men list. Buddy, come on. Sorry, he really wants to be part of this time. So to sum this one up, basically a year ago, this list came. I guess it was compiled a year ago. Anonymous, crowdsourced list that was kept as a Google Drive document, not password protected, accessible by anybody. Anybody could edit it. Anybody could see it as long as they had the link. So it was a compilation of accusations and of bad behavior on the part of men who worked in media. And it, I don't remember how many names were on it, but the offenses listed were incredibly wide-ranging, from things like rape and violence and sexual assault to things like flirting or idea theft or creepy indirect messages on Twitter.
And I think this is the thing that surprised me most about it. Or was basically bad to work with, nothing sexual.
Right.
In which case, why are we even restricting this to men? Because women too can be bad to work with.
Yes. Well, the list had to stop somewhere.
Yeah, that's true. But that was something that surprised me. I had thought that the list was just about sort of flirting to rape spectrum, but apparently no.
Yeah, no, it I think, I don't know how it started. By the time I, got eyeballs on it, the story had been and gone. But yeah, it certainly at some point, either earlier or later, became open to gripes that were not remotely really sexual in nature. So that was a year ago. And the existence of the list became widely known. It was reported on in BuzzFeed and a couple of other places. And the list's creator, Moira Donegan, came out in an essay for The Cut because she suspected she was going to be outed by another writer in this Harper's.
Katie Roiphe.
Yeah.
Who has a history of being sort of contrarian on feminist issues, like since the 90s. So
right.
Yeah.
So fast forward a year later, one man, Stephen Elliott, who was on the list, accused of, so the specific wording was not rape, but rape accusation.
Right.
Seems like a little bit of hair splitting, but it's worth mentioning. So he wrote an essay for Quillette describing how his life was upended by his inclusion on this list. What he says is a false allegation. I think that his specific wording was that he does not honestly believe that anybody there's anybody in the world who believes that he raped them, and that none of his critics or the people claiming to believe this allegation actually believe it either. And he describes how he lost professional relationships, personal relationships, professional opportunities, basically, that he had to leave his career as a writer and go work as a house painter in New Orleans. And, just basically described how these allegations ruined his life. And then on the last day before the statute of limitations ran out, he filed a lawsuit against Moira Donegan, but also against, anonymous Jane Doe contributors to the list, suing for over $1 million in damages to, recoup what was lost and to find out who, and this seems to be a big element of it, to find out who initially made these allegations against him. And the news of this lawsuit has been met with a lot of derision in the media, including from apparently some of the other men included on the list. And there was this article in The Cut.
The strangest, okay, I'm going to just interrupt.
Yeah, no, you please, go ahead, I've been talking forever.
No, it's the strangest article I've ever read for so many reasons. And I'm going to have to quote three of the five men to explain why it's so strange. So the article, it's again in The Cut, which is part of New York Magazine. It's where that Moira Donegan essay also appeared. So I don't know if that matters so much for
I
context.
think that we should, we might as well allow that the cut cannot really claim to be neutral on this topic.
I don't think they really are, because there was one of the suggested articles on this was something like how to contribute to her GoFundMe. So I don't think they're particularly claiming that. But what's so strange about this article? So the article is by Ruth Spencer, and she interviews 5 anonymous men who are on the shitty media men list. Now, the fact that these men are being interviewed anonymously means that you do not know which of these men was accused of what, right? So that already is a sort of strange ambiguity here. Then if you're just baseline going into the topic, there's the ambiguity of, do these men not want a lawsuit because they've just come around now? They're such wonderful feminist allies that they, want to protect women's rights to a whisper network to protect themselves? Or is it that they, and this would be, I think, the common sense interpretation, this was an awkward time for them, whether or not they did anything, and they don't want it dredged up again, and better to let the thing go forgotten. But anyway, so what struck me as so strange about this article were these 3 quotes, okay, from these men. The first, okay, I didn't do what I'm accused of on the list, but obviously I wronged somebody to the point that they want to mess with my life. Okay, that's the first. The second quote, look, the specific allegations against me on the list aren't true, but I understand how I ended up on it, and I do have amends to make. And the third, which I'm going to look at a little more closely, I don't know why I'm on there exactly, but I'm not going to say that I've never crossed a line. Now, just looking at that third one, close read style, this is definitely why I got a PhD in literature, was so I could do this. If he doesn't know why he's on there exactly, I feel like this word exactly is, as they would say in academia, which we'll talk about soon, doing a lot of work. The word exactly is what? Is it that this man does not know precisely which of the many times he was being awful is being referenced? Is it that he has no idea why this happened, and he's, self-flagellating because he doesn't want to be a bad person? It could be either. You don't know. And then the fact that, and when he says he's not going to say he never crossed the line, does he mean he was never flirtatious? Does he mean he never assaulted somebody? You don't know. So basically you put these 3 together and it's very ambiguous. What are they even talking about? What is the article even doing? Are these men, and again, there's the possibility that they're all doing different things from one another, but are they proclaiming their innocence? Are they is it weasel words? Are they kind of walking a line between saying that they did something but not exactly this, so don't sue me or something? Or are they saying, or are they being kind of like self-flagellating, trying to distance themselves from this Stephen Elliott to say that they are good feminists who support the MeToo movement, unlike him? And I just think it's not in the text, and that's why I found it such a strange article.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you say, what is this article doing? I mean, I think the thing that it primarily does is it establishes that there's one line that the media mainly is taking when it comes to how they respond to this lawsuit. And it kind of reinforces that. I mean, because it's so sparse on information. We don't know who these guys are. We have no idea whether they were accused of rape or sliding into somebody's DMs, or something so ambiguous. And this is the thing about so many of the entries on the list. When the guy says, I don't know why I'm on there exactly. I mean, it could be because the allegation against him was something so nebulous that, it could refer to either any number of times that he flirted with somebody at work, or he just, it's open to interpretation. Like he doesn't remember doing anything like what's described, but, is thinking like, maybe I did and I forgot about it. The thing that strikes me about all of these statements is that it actually reminds me a lot of some of the stuff that other guys, including James Franco and Al Franken, said in response to the allegations against them, when they got called out sort of in the, I think it was earlier days of the MeToo movement, where James Franco issued a sort of similar statement where he said, I'm not going to actively refute these accusations because I think the movement is that important. Which of course is like, there's definitely a denial embedded in there.
But I don't know that there is. See, that's where I'm not sure I agree, because I think there could be a denial, but I think what it's also doing rhetorically is allowing this weird having cake and eating it too type stance, where by using the language of the good ally, a man is able to kind of confess without confessing to something. So you don't know. I mean, I guess that's where I just feel like I'm stuck, is that you don't know.
Yeah.
Either
well, I mean,
it's just
open to interpretation.
Yeah. And that's, I don't know, that was what I found so strange about that article. But yeah.
I mean, certainly my takeaway from it was that all of these guys were saying, I didn't do what I was accused of. And then, and there was one who specifically didn't say anything like that. And I thought, like, oh God, who is he and what did he do? Because he talks about, saying, like, about making apologies and flagellating himself to the people in his life, who saw him on the list. But yeah, I mean, to me, the way that this was worded, it was all of these guys basically saying, I was falsely accused too of something I didn't do. But you don't see me being such a big baby about it that I file a lawsuit.
Yeah, this is where I think that's possible, but I just don't think it's in the text. I don't think they're unambiguously saying I was falsely accused. I think that this brings up sort of a bigger sort of issue to do with how certainly the lawsuit is being discussed. So I guess I feel like there's this kind of lost middle ground again. I'm sorry, I keep talking about lost middle grounds, but where I don't think that the issue of men falsely accused of sexual harassment or assault is remotely on the scale of the issue of women being harassed or assaulted and unable to get justice. These are just things happening on different scales. So I personally am not devoting my life to the cause of the falsely accused man. However, I do not fault the men who are falsely accused for complaining about this. It just seems so strange that there seems to be this mood online of that if a man is falsely accused, he should just kind of shut up, which doesn't really make any sense.
Not only shut up, but remain a cheerleader for
his accusers.
It's yeah. And here's the thing. This line jumped out at me from this series of interviews. This one guy says, I don't think he has a case, and I don't think this is a case that should be pressed even if he had one. Basically, even if he were falsely accused of rape, I don't think that he should be getting upset about it.
That's just, to me, seems very strange. I have no idea. I do not know these people. I am quite disconnected from the New York media world, considering on paper I wouldn't be that disconnected from it. But I mean, I live in Toronto and I do not mingle socially with that world. But so I don't have any sense of whether, I had never heard of this Stephen Elliott, and I don't have any opinion on any of this from like previous knowledge. It just seems like if he understands himself to have been falsely accused, it's hard to fault him for complaining about that. That doesn't, yeah. But no, I mean, I guess what struck me about this, again, as somebody who's not particularly wrapped up in this personally with the media angle, it just seems like MeToo, and the way I'll conclude my portion of this, I guess, is that MeToo has been kind of three different things. So, and forgive me that I am looking at my notes on this because otherwise I'm going to get it wrong. So the first has been kind of so two have been good, one not good. So the first that's been good has been kind of hope for justice, basically. So there's been this long, millennia long, perhaps, history of women being assaulted, mistreated in different ways by men, especially in talking more recently in the professional sphere, who now feel a hope for getting justice that they didn't before. Okay, so that's one. Then there's this kind of, the next step would be this sort of permission to be angry or upset about things that in the past women were, not all women, but many women were angry and upset about, but didn't feel permission to express being angry or upset about, because there was this feeling like, well, that's just how life is, you got to just suck it up. So fine. So Me Too has also, I think, sort of given permission to be upset about things. But then I think the problem is this third category, which is this creation of this kind of ambiguous category of shitty behavior, bad behavior, problematic, whatever, that is stuff that women in the past, in the age before apps, certainly before dating apps, just that was just part of dating. That was just part of human interaction. But that's gotten kind of retroactively cast as terrible. And I think the problem with that list and the accusations on it is that some of the things really are like older man who likes younger women. It's like, yeah, well, okay, like, is that, or flirting or things like this? Yes, if it's your boss, it's a problem. If it's two coworkers, is it inherently a problem? Well, if the man doesn't, but people did used to flirt, yeah. So that's it. I guess that's how I see it, is that there's kind of these three categories of what Me Too has sort of brought about, and two are useful and one is not great. And it also sort of denies the existence of women who like men. I don't know how to put this, but and who get actual sort of like, who get positive, good things from life, from romantic and just flirtatious interactions with men. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, feel more anxiety about false accusations, particularly in this moment where the bar for making an allegation has been so substantially lowered that it's considered a valid thing to go on the internet and anonymously accuse somebody of rape, on a it is a public document. Like, this is the other thing, is that I feel like characterizing this document as a whisper network is, I don't know, somewhere between naive to actively disingenuous, where, you've got this thing online that makes incredibly incendiary allegations that anybody can edit,
including it could be men.
Yes, exactly.
That's something I've wondered about with the list, that what if it's just a man with a grudge against another man, which I'm not going to get into this other cases have happened like this, but yeah.
It's certainly possible. But yeah, to express surprise that this list ended up being weaponized, is sort of like, dropping a ball on a slope and then being shocked when it rolls downhill. That was always going to happen. And I'm trying to, I got derailed there for a second. But yeah, to lower the bar for making an allegation like this, and, to create a situation in which someone can basically do the equivalent of like scrawling a rape allegation in a high school burn book, and have it be taken very seriously. A lot of people have been sort of mocking or doubting Stephen Elliott's description of this allegation as life-ruining. But at the same time, these 5 guys who were also accused on the list don't want to give their names. They're in this article saying like, oh, it's so bad that he's brought a lawsuit. He should just put up and shut up. But none of them are willing to step back into the spotlight and be associated with it again. So,
and yet there's Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. So clearly the fact that somebody has said that you may have done something bad in your past does not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I think it depends where in society it's happening also. I think
New
York media is probably its own. Yeah.
Right. Kavanaugh was such a unique thing, and I have, another conversation's worth of thoughts on why it was not a great idea to make that case into a referendum on how we treat victims of sexual assault. And that I think it backfired that it ended up being cast that way, but that's not on our list of topics.
No. Oh, but do you have any grievances though? That's the question.
Do I have grievances?
Grievances, because we're going to talk about grievances.
Well, I could study grievances, apparently.
Yes, apparently there's departments just dedicated to that. So given the time, we're going to talk about grievances.
Yeah, let's wrap up with the shitty media men and move on.
Yes. So shitty media men on to intentionally shitty academic papers. That is the most awkward transition I've come up with yet.
You did a good job.
So we're going to talk about, more briefly, but the Grievance Studies hoax, which Helen Pluckrose, James A. Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian sent out a bunch of fake academic papers, a handful of which did in fact get published, many of which for various reasons did not, most of which for various reasons did not. But anyway, they were all kinds of, it was most famously, the examples were an edited excerpt of Mein Kampf, making it into a feminist journal, and the peer-reviewed academic journal, and the other something to do with rape culture at the dog park, making it into some other journal, apparently. So basically there was this hoax, and they wrote about it in Aereo magazine. And the whole point was basically look at these silly disciplines where they'll publish garbage. What does that say about A, these disciplines, B, the state of academia? So, oh boy, where to begin?
Well, I would say that I wish I had it up, but I'm not sure that they would have described the hoax quite the way that you just did.
Well, they do talk about academia and these particular disciplines. They talk about both of these.
Yeah, I think the argument being made was that there is an ideological bent in certain segments of academia that is causing a lack of scrutiny when it comes to letting certain things pass that might otherwise not be allowed to pass if they affirmed more popular ideologies within the fields. Yes,
that's right. That this is, I think that I agree that that's what they're saying. That they're saying that garbage can get through these gatekeepers if it's politically correct garbage, basically. Or not politically correct in the general sense, but within these disciplines. Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of like set this up in terms of where I think this fits into this kind of history of conservative, or not necessarily conservative, critiques of academia. And then I'm going to defend to the death the right to study the most aggrieved thing. No. Well, okay. So we'll see. We'll see how SJW / problematic my take on all of this winds up being. Basically, so just to step back, the topic of aren't things bonkers in academia has been kind of a conservative publication mainstay forever. There was Alan Bloom writing The Closing of the American Mind, which I read like a million years ago as a college student and have not reread for this blogging heads. There have been over the years, and I used to keep track of these on my blog over the years, although not so much recently, in like National Review and Weekly Standard, there'd be these, like a regular beat was look at all these ridiculous things happening on college campuses. This is just like, and it wouldn't, where the goal seemingly wasn't improving academia, but mocking it. And mocking it for an audience not of academics. Mocking it for maybe an audience of sort of concerned parents about where, because the concern was always that the tenured radicals, that there were these, sort of ex-hippies in the classroom who were going to indoctrinate your kids. In recent years, this all seems to have shifted a bit, where the fear is no longer so much the professors being too radical, but students, this fear of the sort of hypersensitive, aggrieved student. And that's shifted really in just the last few years. And also what's shifted is it's not really conservatives only who are talking about this anymore. It's also people who identify as liberals, although what that means in different contexts is quite varied. Whether it's like classical liberals or people who say they're progressives but internally critical of other progressives, or all these different things. And then there's the thing with this particular hoax, which is about academics, not about students, where they're not saying, look at these silly students. It's sort of returning to that model of look at these silly subjects, but rather than doing the sort of old-timey National Review Weekly Standard thing of look at these silly students, or sorry, look at these silly subjects, they're actually going in and trying to prove the silliness with these papers getting through. I guess that's, and what was always strange with the sort of old conservative critique was that it was this mix of complaining that academia was impractical, but also complaining that it's not just a great books curriculum anymore. So that always seemed strange to me. It was like, which is it? But in terms of this particular hoax, I guess where maybe we'll disagree, who knows, and have a raucous, chaotic debate. I guess the question is, does it demonstrate what the authors say it does? And I think it can have value even if it doesn't. But I guess to me it demonstrated that not everything published in any field is earth-shattering, which is something that I think people in academia know, but that isn't necessarily, like, I think outside of academia there may be this understanding that because something has been peer-reviewed and published, it's really important. But like, that's not quite how it goes. It's just, it's a new finding, may not be a very important one. Mm-hmm. I think it demonstrated, which I think people had already known, that peer review isn't fact-checking. These are different things. It demonstrated that reviewers are not compensated. So this is sort of extra work that people, including grad students, are doing for journals. And this is different from like when somebody in HR is reviewing a CV, where they're paid for that. It sort of happens a little differently. I think it demonstrated, so one of the things that the hoax authors cited wasn't just the papers getting accepted, but even that the ones that were rejected were told this was a very important and interesting contribution, but we couldn't take it. That to me just demonstrates sort of collegiality in academia and the sort of politeness standards of how things are turned down. So I don't think much could be read into that. And also just the fact that people in academia would assume that papers were submitted in good faith. And I think it demonstrates that, for better or worse, to get into academia and stay in it, you have to churn out a whole lot of stuff. You have to churn out a whole lot of stuff, and you have to, as a reviewer, process a whole lot of stuff. So a lot of crummy stuff can get published. The question is, what does all of this say about ideology? And for me, that's where this gets a little ambiguous. I think, and I mean, they didn't, this wasn't meant to be sort of a scientific approach, really. So who knows what would have happened if they'd submitted garbage in other contexts. And it seemed like they were out to prove that specific fields are nonsense rather than to prove sort of structural things about academia generally. Why am I wrong?
I'm not sure that you are. And of course, I am not in academia. So for me, when you talk about things like the culture of needing to publish or perish and all of that kind of stuff, I'm just over here like, yes, okay, like I believe you. I think the aim to show that that certain disciplines have an ideological bent and are more amenable to publishing things that reinforce those ideologies is probably the place in which, you said it gets ambiguous. I think it's where they probably have actually made a point. And the way that I've been looking at this is, I look at their acceptance rate and, how much effort they had to put in to do this as compared with, somebody who's doing it in a genuine way. I would say clearly something something is going on there. Like, they did prove something.
Well, they put a ton of effort into it. I mean,
compared with what it would have taken to do, I mean, they were churning out a paper every 2 weeks, I think was the, so clearly it was less effort than it would have taken to actually conduct the studies themselves.
Well, I mean, they're not also TAing several classes, and I think it's hard to say. I think
we clearly have very different perspectives on this, from the point of view of somebody who's in academia and somebody who's
I'm sort of one
at all.
I have a strange 1 foot in, one but anyway, I mean, I think so. Go on with the ideology.
But here's what my takeaway was from it, which is that certainly, we all have things that we are more prepared to accept as true because they reinforce for us something that we already believe in, and that belief is probably not coming from a super scientific place. Like, if I published a paper tomorrow saying that, I had, pretty incontrovertible evidence that Donald Trump is a lizard wearing a human skin, there would be, a skeptical response, but there would also be a substantial number of people who were like, yeah, I always knew that. Like, I was totally right. It happened. They're out there on like TrumpReptilianSupport.org. Anyway, so, I think that everybody has this tendency to, accept things that support what we already, that validate us in something we already believe, and to reject the things that call that into question. And that's a very human thing. But that it's a luxury you can't afford in truth-seeking disciplines. And that, that means academia, it means science, and it means journalism too, which is sort of where I started seeing like, okay, where is there an intersection between this hoax and something that's more familiar to me? And I think, the thing that can be said about what happened with these papers is that certainly you had people reading them who were more friendly to the ideas contained therein, and who were more likely to let them pass without a lot of scrutiny because they stroked some existing bias. In the same way that I actually saw this a lot during the Kavanaugh hearings. You would have, something that was ambiguous, like the Julie Swetnick allegations or the meaning of the term Devil's Triangle, where people would start out having already concluded that that Kavanaugh was a liar and a bad person, and they would go looking for evidence to support that conclusion. And then it turned out not to be the case. And it was, these are like a couple of pretty narrow examples. Like, you can still think that Kavanaugh is a bad person, just for the record. But, basically that people are always drawing conclusions first and then looking for evidence to support it second, and that's a normal thing to do, but it's something that people who work in academia or other truth-seeking disciplines need to resist. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen. That didn't happen here. And it was interesting to see this come up in the wake of another story about a paper that was accepted and then rejected and then accepted and then rejected at two places because it did draw scrutiny and it created outrage. I think it was about like gender differences in mathematical skills or something like that.
Yes.
And it was an example of something that, an idea that received extra attention and received extra scrutiny because it was offensive to the people who were reading it, mm-hmm. As opposed to these ideas that were given a pass despite not being rigorous enough, really, to
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to me, that's what the hoax illustrates, essentially.
So, I think that's what the hoax thinks it illustrates, but where I'm not convinced is they didn't also submit there wasn't sort of like the ones to demonstrate this successfully. I think they would have also had to try to get sort of conservative papers through these gatekeepers. They would have had to try to go with different disciplines. It seemed like the only things they were testing were these what they call grievance studies disciplines.
So I definitely agree that it would have been,
because I just don't think it can demonstrate quite that it's ideological. I think it demonstrates, what it does demonstrate, I think, is a sort of weakness in the sort of truth-seeking aspect of this process. But I don't think it demonstrates that weakness pertains specifically to ideology. It could just as easily pertain to ideology in these fields, but then a different ideology in economics or political science. You know, it could depend on which field. But also, I just think if what's getting past gatekeepers gets past gatekeepers because there just simply there either aren't the resources or isn't the interest in sort of truth seeking, if it's just you send something in with enough plausible evidence, it gets published, because I think that is generally how it can work in academia, certainly in a not super prestigious journal. Who's to say? You know, like, I think they were trying to show that these ideologically charged things would make it past a gatekeeper, and they were explicitly not trying to demonstrate that ideologically neutral or conservative things would. So we have this story about the math paper that wasn't part of this hoax, it wasn't part of their experiment. We don't have I feel like their data is missing something to demonstrate that it's ideological.
Absolutely. I mean, if you were trying to do this as like a rigorous study instead of as a, attention getting.
But they are so the promoters of rigor. You know what I mean? They're saying they're truth seeking, and I'm saying, anecdotally, I absolutely have no qualm with with that somebody who's in a gender studies department probably has certain politics. I do not remotely doubt that. I can speak to just anecdotal evidence and just common sense. Like, of course, that's not really so much the issue. It's more, are they demonstrating that these particular fields are bullshit, or are they demonstrating that there's just kind of problems with peer review that could well transcend those fields? And I guess my sort of bigger question about this is, what's their end game? Is it to improve academia, or is it to just kind of join the forces mocking it? And
we should ask them.
Yeah, we should. Because I couldn't tell from their article. I couldn't tell from the article about it. It was a bit ambiguous to me. But
buddy,
do you think your cat knows?
I think he's sick of this topic.
Okay.
He had a violent reaction just now to something, although.
Well, then I think we can agree to partially disagree, but have many questions for the authors, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to reiterate that I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who doesn't really even understand fully what peer review is. So
okay, so I do and I don't. I have one peer-reviewed publication. I have a doctorate. I have published a ton outside of academia, like articles and the book for, to call it popular audiences seems a little ridiculous, but not an academic book. So, and my job is that I teach as a lecturer at a university, but the writing I do is outside of academia. So I'm not, but I know a lot of people in academia for a whole bunch of reasons. So I do kind of know a lot about it firsthand. But I don't really know people in these particular fields that this was about so much. The so-called Grievance Studies. My doctorate is in French and French studies, and I promise that French studies is not about how aggrieved the French are. It's not that. So I think we're going to move on to recommendations. We're going to
the fun part.
So we have some Halloween themed, some non-Halloween themed recommendations. We'll start maybe with a non-Halloween themed, which is to finish watching Insatiable. If you started, keep going with it. The season 1. Why?
Well, I mean, because it gets interesting, right?
It does. It gets so interesting. So I've always thought, and I don't know how much of this is my age and how much of this is this show itself, but when I would watch, especially My So-Called Life, but just generally teen shows as a younger person, I would always think that the parents' plot line was so boring. Like, if there was some way to fast forward that, I would have. Because who cares? Well, these stupid parents, they're like financial stresses at work, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? When the teenagers were where all the fun stuff was. Insatiable flips that. In Insatiable, the teenagers are preoccupied by mainly beauty pageants, which, and I mean, there's more to it. That's definitely underselling it.
Yeah.
But there is more to it. There's definitely more to it. And they have a lot of drama. But, the parents, where to begin?
I mean, the parents' romantic and sexual drama vastly overshadows that of the teenagers, which I think is, know, what makes the show unusual and also successful.
Yes. I mean, it's certainly, so the show revolves around really two people. It was, when it caused all this controversy by existing, it was about how the star was going to be this teenage girl who lost a tremendous amount of weight and then became sort of conventionally hot. Well, that's one of the two main plots, but then there's the other star who's this pageant coach and sort of high-powered but never really at work lawyer, who is this middle-aged man who both likes to spend time, with all these attractive young girls and has a wife, but also, is he gay? Is he not? But then this gets answered. Spoiler alert, whatever. He's bi, basically. And yeah, how that plays out is unexpected. For
what it's worth, every review, including the scathing ones of this show, did mention the ultimate resolution of this plot line. So, I think that you could go ahead and say the word thruple.
Thruple. Yeah. So there's a fleeting thruple, man, woman thruple, where the Bob Armstrong's character and his nemesis, Bob Barnard, become a couple. Bob Barnard, famously always shirtless Bob Barnard. But then, oh my God, the actress's name is
Alyssa Milano.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, because this is important, right? I don't know the actors' names, but Alyssa Milano playing the wife of Bob Armstrong is, first it's like she's the betrayed spouse, but then she sees them kissing and she's like, and then they're like, the three of them are a throuple briefly, but then it turns out that Bob Barnard is just gay and does not want a throuple. But I don't know. I thought that was different. I thought that was an interesting twist. I thought in terms of discussions around MeToo and so forth, there's obviously Alyssa Milano is an important figure in the MeToo movement. You probably know more about this than I do.
Well, I mean, she was, sitting behind Kavanaugh at the hearings, holding a sign. But, it was interesting to see her in this show, especially after it drew all this scrutiny, because she came out at the time in defense of it, saying, it's not what it's being accused of. And she really commits to her character. I mean, she, and it wouldn't work as well if she didn't. But she really does.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought it was a very different sort of what do women want scenario than you kind of get in pop culture or recent media stories, where she was affirmatively consenting to not just a man, but two, which,
yes,
that's different. And I think you don't see that every day. And I think you certainly, among the plot lines with the teenagers, it almost seems like this whole thing about I guess they aren't really millennials, but like this whole narrative of like the sort of the uptight millennials versus the sort of more freewheeling, somewhat older people seem to kind of maybe tap into that, where the kids are they're not such young. I mean, they're probably, I would assume these actors are probably
in their early 20s.
Yeah, they're probably, they're probably not actually teenagers, but they're they're not conservative exactly, but they don't want anything so unusual.
Right.
Yeah, so that's Insatiable. Definitely, it's different. And I think the parents are more interesting than the kids.
Yes. And if you liked Insatiable, and you want something that's sort of insatiable flavored, but also seasonally thematic for Halloween, there is a new series on Hulu called Light as a Feather. And it actually succeeds in one of the places where Insatiable was maybe a little bit iffy, in that the episodes are only about 25 minutes long instead of an hour. So it's very easy to binge your way through it. And it's a solid entry into the cursed teen party game kind of echelon of Halloween themed stories, in which these kids get together to play light as a feather, stiff as a board in a graveyard, and then start dying off one by one. It's fluffy fun. It's not super scary, but it's enjoyable. My only complaint about this show is that they introduce very early on a plot line in which one of the characters appears to be incubating some kind of like demonic cocoon inside of her body, and then they never explain what it is.
What?
Spoiler alert for this thing never being spoiled or resolved. Maybe in season 2, assuming there is a season 2.
And any other recommendations?
I do, in fact, have one other seasonal recommendation, because I love Halloween and I love horror. The Netflix Haunting of Hill House is absolutely solid, scary shit.
Well, that sounds great. I'm going to recommend, I'm not particularly horror savvy, but for my Halloween recommendation, my staying in and not doing anything themed Halloween recommendation is Midsomer Murders, which I have not discovered this. This is an old show, but it continues. It's a British show that you can watch on Netflix, all whatever 20 something seasons of. It's hilarious, but it's done in this very like deadpan way where they're all taking everything really, really seriously. It also has some sort of unusual what women want themes, where a kind of persistent motif in Midsomer, I want to say Midsomer, I guess it's just Midsomer Murders, is much older women and much younger men.
Oh.
So that sort of keeps happening in different episodes, where you will see, like, you can always just kind of tell, like, you don't know who the murderer is going to be. So there's a lot of use of the gender neutral they, even in the early seasons of Midsomer Murders, because you don't know who the murderer is, and they have to say they. The cops have to say they, because.
But this is not a recent.
No, it's from the 90s originally, possibly
Ooh.
even early 90s. I'm not sure, but it's still going. It's like there are new seasons of it.
Okay.
And the earlier seasons have more often a sexual deviancy angle. I think the later seasons a little less, but I'm not going to spoil any of these episodes, but it can be pretty out there. But it's just often, it's like really funny, and it's intentionally funny, but it's not a comedy. I don't know how to explain it better than that, but it's really good. It's really just like, it's not so good that it can't be something you watch to kind of fall asleep, because it can also be that. But, and the murders are never like particularly gruesome or upsetting, because it's just also ridiculous. And it's all about these grudges in this small town England, basically, over the most ridiculous things. People are competing with different sorts of vegetables or rabbits, and there's always a fate, like the party in the town square. It's really good, really good.
Okay. Well, I think that does us for today.
Yeah, I think so. We have given you lots of time of us chatting. So, all right.
Still here. All right.
Have a nice Halloween, everybody.